All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you for coming. My name is Savannah, and I'm the producer of the Roxborough House Roundtables at Jefferson East Falls. Each episode is recorded and later posted on our YouTube and SoundCloud for those who were not able to make it to the live event. They are also aired on the first and third Sundays of each month from 8 to 9 a.m. on G-Town Radio 92.5 FM WGGT. We will be talking about sex abuse and pedophilia. The story can sometimes be graphic and disturbing. If this makes you uncomfortable, please don't feel obligated to stay. If you are experiencing difficulties with cults or know people who are, we can refer you to cultrecovery101.com. They provide many resources to aid in these troubling times. For today's roundtable, we are honored to have Daniella Mestyanek Young, a best-selling author and religious pedophilia survivor. Her book, unCULTured, has been featured in the Rolling Stone magazine and has been selected as Amazon Editor's Pick, Best Biographies and Memoirs. Also joining on the panel, we have Professor David Prisco, who is a psychology professor and Associate Director of Internships. And moderating, we have Evan Lane, Director of Law and Society, and the Arlen Specter Center. And now, I'll hand it off to Evan Lane.
Thank you, Savannah, and I'm going to hand it off to Ms. Young.
All right, I am going to start by reading the prologue of the book. You belong to us. I can't hear the exact words being yelled, but the words don't matter. I know what the tone means. We own you. My hands reach toward the sky, knuckles white as I struggle to maintain my grasp on the duffel bag stuffed with pieces of gear I don't know how to use. My muscles scream as I force my arms to keep the bag aloft. The voices grow louder. I don't know how many. I can see the fear and confusion on the faces of my fellow soon-to-be soldiers around me. But I am not afraid. If the people shouting were going to hit me, they would have by now. They want a reaction, so I know not to give them one. Keep your head down. Don't make eye contact. Do what they say. I know how to tune out, to go outside my body. I know the trick of focusing on a meaningless detail. All I see is the drab green bag in someone else's hands. I allow it to fill my vision, my mind. I make it the centerpiece of my world. The yelling started the moment the bus full of recruits came to a stop at Fort Jackson, South Carolina. Everyone in our group shot to their feet, shuffling down the aisle, bodies colliding with one another, held vertical by the mass of people pressing up against them. We had no idea why we were in trouble, what we had done to earn this verbal beating, but we all had the same instinct. We'd do anything to make it stop. We fly into formation, standing shoulder to shoulder, staring straight ahead, unblinking, not daring to move even when the drops of sweat slide from the base of our necks all the way down our backs and into the cracks of our asses. We clench tighter and try not to shiver. Don't move. Don't be the one who stands out. Don't become the failing one out of many. The yells turn into words. Grab your duffel bag. Lift it above your head as high as you can. I know what is happening. I read about it online after signing my paperwork. This is how they shock your system. We'll be here for at least an hour, maybe two, straining our arms, dropping our gear, doing push-ups, jumping to our feet, hoisting the 50-pound bags into the air. We'll grunt and gasp and sweat and cry. They scream and we push. We force ourselves past the pain, nausea, and fear. We ignore the little voice saying, "Stop, this is crazy." This is easy for me. It's a switch I can turn on and off. That little voice silenced. My gut ignored. Soon, I will no longer exist. There will be only the group. There will be only Army. Most of these recruits have never left home. 17 is the average age of this summer's class. They could have been camp counselors instead of soldiers. They will finish basic training and then head back for their senior year of high school before reporting back full-time. They are scared, but I am not. They are kids missing their mommies, yearning to go home. But I don't have a home, and my mother could never protect me from anything. I spent my life playing at battle drills, getting ready for what to do when the Antichrist's soldiers showed up. I can't count the hours I spent as a child, standing in line, eating mass-produced food that tasted like cardboard, never quite getting enough to feel full. I was always next to a handler, sleeping and waking, always watched, always commanded. My mind couldn't wander, not even an inch. I know how to follow orders, how to not ask questions. I was born a soldier. I stand staring at the big blue sky, straining under the weight of my equipment, trying to block out the drill sergeant's shouts. I am suddenly 9 years old again, standing on the Brazilian shore, eyes glued to the horizon, imagining I can see the shores of Angola across the Atlantic. As the waves wash the sand from my toes, I wonder what would happen if I started swimming, if I swam until I couldn't anymore. But there is a big white van parked a few yards up the shore, waiting to return us to the gray walls of the commune, the whitewash of the children's dorms, the home of my loneliness, hunger, and fear. Higher, a voice yells, get your bag in the air. The blue sky is a promise and a lie, with no real portent of freedom for me, not since I signed on that dotted line. I let out a gasp, almost releasing my grip on the duffel, and with it, my tenuous hold in the group, as a sharp thought pierces my consciousness. Did I just join another cult? Dun, dun, dun. And the interesting part is, I didn't freak out after that. I just thought, I'm gonna be better at this than all of these suckers, because I know how to just completely tamp down everything about my individuality. And one of the things I've found since writing this book is that it's actually quite common for children from high control religions, high control, high demand groups to go into the military. And across the board, we do very well. And across the board, we say that there was nothing harder that we had to do in the military that we didn't have to do in our childhoods. So why I wrote this book is because I had decided I wanted to be a speaker. I like telling stories, and I like being an expert. And I said I was going to talk about growing up in this cult, which the cult is the Children of God. And they are the most famous for using religious prostitution to get money and followers. They called it flirty fishing. And for pedophilia, like preaching essentially pedophilia for God. And, you know, it went, God is love. The way that our prophet made his like unique value proposition, like made himself stand out from all of the other cults popping up in the late 60s, early 70s, was by sort of taking evangelical control of sex and purity culture and just flipping it. And he called it free love. I call it forced polyamory. And we, you know, then devolved to being, you will find Children of God on all of the lists of bad stuff. And anytime I would talk about, I grew up in this cult, people would say to me, oh, well, the cult is obviously evil. But then anytime I would talk about being in the military, and I was in like veteran services, right? So I was in a very like pro-military environment. And anytime I would talk about being in the Army, people would then say, oh, but the Army is a wonderful organization. And I was like, all right, like hold the phone with both of these, right? Nothing is ever obviously evil in the place where it comes from. And second of all, the United States Army is 1.3 million people trained to kill human beings in the most efficient way possible, right? Like that's what we are. A military, what it does at its core is program individuals to conduct violence on behalf of state. And so I said to myself, you know, none of these stories are the way that people think. And while I was watching a cult leader run America the first time, I said, you know what? I think I am going to parallel these to each other. And there was this, I had just started doing my master's in organizational psychology, and there was this teamwork quote or concept that I couldn't stop thinking about, which was human beings will do almost anything to fit into their voluntary groups. And I was like, I think I can show you that in this microsystem of a cult, and not just any cult, one of the most extreme cults, and then show you again in the United States Army, which, like it or not, is a group that we all support with our taxes. And I specifically chose to parallel like the sexual violence in the cult and the sexual violence for women in the military. My chapter on basic training is called Drink the Kool-Aid. And then while I was studying organizational psychology, I had a very interesting experience because I was like, everybody comes to this. You know, these are all the people that are going to work in all the corporations that are going to hire all of you, and they're going to teach them how to motivate you and how to, you know, not harass you and all of these things. And my only group experience was cults and army and terrorist groups, because I was the intelligence officer and I went to Afghanistan twice. We studied counterterrorism. So I started to realize, like, I have this extreme amount of experience in bad guys. And everyone else just assumes that all the corporations they're going to go work at are the good guys, right? We are here in organizational psychology to study happy, smiley groups and make them better. And nobody wanted to talk about the dark triad of leadership: Machiavellianism, narcissism, and psychopathy. In fact, they always said, we'll come back to this, and we never did. And anytime I brought up examples, people would roll their eyes, like, oh, here's the cult lady again. However, they were all more than happy to use the cult leader tactics, I found, because this is what we are studying. You know, to me, organizational psychology is people that study motivation tactics and human behavior tactics, and then sell their services to corporate America to help them motivate you, to help them build their good cults. However, I will preempt the most popular question. I don't believe in good cults. And so finally, I was at Harvard, and I requested them to let me add the psychology of cults. There was a course called the psychology of cults, and to my organizational psychology degree. And they denied me because they said, it's not enough about groups. And that was when I had this very interesting realization that, oh, nobody considers cults and terrorist groups and gangs and other forms of extreme groups to be successful organizations, right? But if I told you about a group of people, of more than 10,000 people, who tended to be devoted for life to doing dangerous missions around the globe and brought in millions of dollars a year, you wouldn't think that that was not a successful organization until I told you that I'm talking about the Taliban or the Children of God. And so this is when I determined that I don't actually care about the groups. I don't know if groups want to be better or if they can be better under patriarchy, white supremacy, and capitalism, these three overarching cult systems that we have in America. And I decided that I was going to become the disorganizational psychologist and use like all of my skills in diagnosing the bad guy to help individuals understand groups that have hurt you in the past, are hurting you now, and might hurt you in the future. Because the real thing is, I hate all of the definitions of cults. Like, as a cult baby, which is a name we came up for ourselves, I hate your definition, because as soon as you put a definition on it, the cults are going to take that definition, say thank you very much, and use that to train their people in why they aren't cults, right? And I get asked this question all of the time, like, what's the line, they will say, because now I'm famous for being the knitting cult lady who just compares everything to cults because I think it's useful. And people say, what is the line? And there's this very interesting thing that I used to tell my boss in the military when I was the intelligence officer. I'm the expert on the bad guy. My area of expertise literally was things that kill helicopter pilots in Afghanistan. And then I married a special operations helicopter pilot. But everyone gets mad at the intelligence officer, just like people give death threats to the weatherman, right? Because nobody wants to hear you say, like, you can't do this, or they're gonna hurt you. Everybody wants comforting answers. And I used to tell my boss all the time, like, I'm not the chaplain. I'm not supposed to care about soldiers' morale. I'm supposed to care about getting them safe. And we keep the good guys, yes, grown men in camouflage pajamas call themselves the good guys with their full chests. We keep the good guys safe by knowing every possible thing that we can about the bad guys. Because the truth is, and what you will learn real fast when you are a helicopter battalion flying along the border of Pakistan and Afghanistan, and there's this line in the sand, and if you cross it, everyone is having a bad day. The best thing that's going to happen to you for crossing that line is your boss will be on the phone with the President of the United States, because it's an international incident. And they would cross it all the time. And my intelligence soldiers would be like, what? I don't understand. How hard is it? They're looking at the map, right? Where there's a very clear line. I just got to the point where I just started sending them out on the next combat mission. Because the thing we don't realize when we talk about the line in the sand is that the whole point of a line in the sand is it doesn't stay, right? You can draw a line in the sand one day. You can't show me that line tomorrow, right? And when you're surrounded by people that look like you and think like you and are encouraging you that you're on the right path, it's really, really, really easy to cross that line. So I do have a definition, and I'll share it. It's long, and then we'll have questions. But one of the things, so I eventually went and sat in the dark after reading everything about cults and just like came up with my definition that felt like a full definition. And then I started writing a book called The Culting of America, where I'm going to show you these 10 parts of group behavior, but then I'm going to show you them in cults, in the military, and then in regular groups around you. And I think if I had just started writing a book, I would have believed that you could contain the definition of cult in a book. However, since I also got online as the knitting cult lady and started my TikTok and social media channels, I now realize that it takes more than a book, right? It takes hundreds, thousands of hours of talking about it and the nuance and the storytelling and understanding how this happens, like how people do extreme things. So I want to tell you, if your professors tell you to be impressed with them because they wrote a book, you should ask them how their TikTok channels are doing. So before I even start with the definition, I like to tell people that what matters when we say cult, right, what we're trying to say, because the word cult is so weaponized, it's so heavy, it's so loaded. But what we're trying to say is that an individual has come under coercive control. And by the way, there are many types of cults. If you come under the coercive control of an individual, in English they call that an abusive relationship. In cultish, we call that a 1-1 cult. When you're growing up under a family that is coercively controlling you, usually with a narcissist and an enabler, both of which are abusers, by the way, we call that a single family cult. And the most famous one is Westboro Baptist Church. But we believe there are many children that have grown up this way. And then when you grow up in some kind of really well laid out organization, they'll call that a real cult. And that's usually what we think of, right? We think of the most extreme. But in reality, like, I'm not the deity that names cults. It's actually the media. And the media only does it when we can measure the damage in bodies. Raped bodies, branded bodies, dead bodies. And so I have decided that, like, as a intelligence professional, my job is to go we call left of the boom in the Army, before the bad thing happens, and try to help people understand the tactics of cults, the techniques of cults, the procedures of cults, and notice the patterns. Because I think that the reality is, again, there is no line between good organization and evil cult. It is all so much more complicated than that. So I do have, since I don't have my slides, I think I have the definition written here, and we can like pass those around as I talk about it. So my definition of cults is, it's a group. It has to be a group. And I just want to say that LGBTQ and trans identity is not a cult. If you've heard that language, it comes directly to you from white nationalism. Identity cannot be a cult. When you talk about 12-step programs as being coercive, which they generally are, they will say, drinking's a cult. Actions cannot be cults. It has to be a group. It has to be at least 2 or more people. It's a group that has charismatic leadership, a sacred assumption, a worldview that brings you under a sacred assumption, right? So everyone thinks cults are religious. Cults can be religious. They absolutely don't have to be. We have exercise cults. We have diet cults. We have yoga cults. Actually, anything in this personal transformation space, college being one of them, is a place where you will find predators who want to coerce you and bring you under control. But cults give you this worldview, right? There is a worldview, and there is one sacred assumption that you must believe if you are going to be a member in good standing of this group. And it's generally some version of, we are the best, and we are the only way. Right, so in the Children of God, the sacred assumption was that this random white dude was the prophet of God who was going to deliver us through the end of days. In Nexium, right, the sacred assumption that Keith Raniere was the smartest man on earth. And in the U.S. Army, I think the sacred assumption is that the United States flag is worth dying for. And as long as you're under this sacred assumption, you can literally justify anything. Right, so you have the sacred assumption, then you have the transcendent mission. This is where I say that cults are always promising space travel. Sometimes it's literal space travel, like Scientology. But it's always something that I promise you in the next life, in the next world, in another body, in another state, right? Because the reality is the promise of the cult is a con, so they can't have you reach enlightenment. But the transcendent mission, it's so good, it's so obvious, it's so right, often it's some form of save the children, that it requires self-sacrifice, which is the 4th thing, is the constant self-sacrifice of members. The 5th thing is isolation, and I like to point out that isolation today no longer means growing up in communes and compounds in Brazil and in Mexico and Texas the way that I did. It can also just be insulation from the world. If any of y'all have heard of the Twin Flames documentary on Netflix, there was a woman in a cult in her bedroom. And of course, cult of MAGA. So isolation or insulation from the world. Then you have language, distinguishable vernacular, right? A language that is more than just jargon. Every kind of job has jargon. I say if you can't drop into like an operations brief or a meeting, a business meeting of that organization without a translator, which is where I put both the Children of God and the Army, then that is a distinguishable vernacular. It's language that is different enough that it makes you feel special for knowing it, but it also isolates you from the group. This is one of the hardest things for veterans getting out of the military, is to learn how to speak like civilians again. Then you have us versus them mentality. Cults are not just being for something, they have to be against something. This is why when we saw a coordinated effort by Swifties to go against Jake Gyllenhaal, everyone was like, it's a cult. Number 8, which ties very intensely to self-sacrifice, number 4. Number 8 is exploitation of labor. Think about capitalism. Number 9 is high entrance cost and exit costs. And number 10 is ends justifies the means mentality. And I feel like, congratulations, if you're in a group that has all 10 of those, congratulations, you're in a cult. However, if you have 5 of those, like, that's still the place I'm gonna look if I'm coming in to help you fix your culture, right? Like, these are all still different things that we can spot in all of our groups. And last thing I'm going to say is that cults pop up in times of social turmoil. And people, nobody joins a cult ever. They join a group or a church or something that they believe is doing something for society. However, what's I saying with that? Cults pop up in times of social turmoil. When we are pulling down systems, understanding that things do not work for us, and seeking to answer life's big questions. It's not a coincidence that the social issues, the fashion, and the cults of the 70s are back right now, all at the same time. And so my, final thing I will say before we open it up to questions is we know that we are living through very, very historic, changing times right now because there's a cult documentary every other day on Netflix. And all of you will experience coercive groups in some way or another trying to take something from you. And I really hope that, and I do have, we'll figure out a way to share it, but I do have a QR code that you can download. Like, I've done all of these lists of culty things. Like, it's not just the one definition. It's also like, I have something called the Guru Gotcha checklist, which is like 20 things to look out for in toxic leaders, same for toxic groups, and all of these different things. But the 2 things I want to say to every single college student in America is if there's a group that is trying to recruit you and everybody is happy and pretty and bouncy and shiny, run. Right? There's a lot of attitude and appearance control going on there. Like you all know, like you and your 5 best friends don't show up all looking good and happy every day, right? It never happens. And the second thing is when somebody tells you you're so mature for your age, they are not complimenting you, they are targeting you. Precocious maturity comes from growing up out of order, which usually comes from trauma. So just keep those 2 things in mind as you are navigating this world of like groups and systems that we are stuck in for the foreseeable future. That's me.
Okay. First of all, I just want to point out this book is amazing. It's for sale afterwards. I've read it. It's not an easy read. I'm not saying that isn't well written. It's extremely well written. It's just the content is difficult. But it's extremely well worth reading, and you'll be signing books
Yes.
later. I was struck by a couple of things that you said, and also in the book. I know you're a parent. I'm a parent, and there's some parents in here, and our main goal is to protect our children at all costs. And in reading your book, which one of the many things that confounded me, and just for some background, in this cult that Daniella was in, the younger, prettier girls were sent out to prostitute themselves, to bring in members and bring in money. They had uncles, which were the older men who took advantage of the very young girls, which included you, in horrific physical, mental, it's just unbelievable. And what struck me is your parents let it happen. And I couldn't understand that. And what I think it shows is the amazing power that the cult has. And that's what I'd like to ask you is, how is it that such absurd idea that this complete nobody is talking to God, but yet people believe it and sacrifice their children for it? How does that happen?
Yeah, so not only did my parents let it happen, but my mother was also born and raised in this cult and was pregnant with me at 14. Yes, my father's older than my grandfather. That's called sex cult math. She was abused by some of the very same uncles, and one of them that you'll read about, Uncle Jerry, you need whiskey for chapter 5. He was one of the founding members of Fleetwood Mac, who joined the cult and proceeded to just be one of the worst abusers maybe ever. And he had abused my mom when she was a teenager. And later we lived with him for 6 years. And it never crossed her mind that he was abusing her children because the rules had changed. Actually, because of me existing, they were like, this is trouble, we can't do this. So now, very a la the Mormons in polygamy, right? We don't give it up. We don't say the leader was ever wrong. We're just saying we don't do this anymore because the outside world doesn't understand it. But because my mom was such a true believer, she just was therefore blinded to all of the danger. But to answer the question more directly, it doesn't happen all at once, right? Like nobody just walks up to you and is like, God says for me to sleep with your wife, right? Like that's not how it happens. It's a process. And part of the process is you are love bombed in the beginning. Like when you first encounter a cult or a coercive group or an abusive relationship, like you have never felt that good in your whole life. It is literally a high. And this is why cults can actually be very good at getting people sober. The Children of God called it getting high on Jesus. And then once you're in and you start realizing what it really is, you're just telling yourself, if I work hard enough, if I follow all the rules, if I sacrifice enough, I will get back to that. But the very bottom line answer is, for me, it comes back to the sacred assumption. And that was a term that I came up with because it's so hard to explain. Like how can people believe in something so intensely that they will sacrifice their children to it? And the answer is just coercive people get you locked into this worldview and into this sacred assumption, and you can literally justify everything. And one of the things that cults do is give you the right to put your mission in front of everything. So I say in my book, you know, they went out to save the world for Jesus before the end of days. That's what they believed they were doing. And they were so busy saving the children of the world that they forgot to save the children of God.
So growing up in that and having a parent that also grew up in that, how did you get to the point of saying, like, this isn't right, I need to leave this? Like, why did that mission not stick with you?
I have a t-shirt where I answered this question, and it says, I'm just a neurodivergent atheist born to religious fundamentalists, you know? And I really, I didn't know, by the way, people read my book and they told me two important things about me. One was that I'm autistic with ADHD, and one was that I had an eating disorder. She's like, she gets it. Now we just joke like it should be obvious. I knit for 12 hours a day and I only talk about cults, right? Like, of course I'm autistic. But, sorry. Oh, I think that helped me a little bit. I also think that the way you break people is isolation, pain, and small acts of kindness. And I say they just forgot about the small acts of kindness with me. I was such a problem. I was such a poorly behaved kid because I liked the question why. And so therefore I spent so much of my childhood in isolation, so much of my childhood just being like them trying to break me. And I was like, no, you will not. You know, when I'm 6 years old after this really horrible scene, I'm just like, if you go to hell for not being in the Children of God, like hell's gonna suck. And so I just always knew I was getting out. And I used to say, you know, I wasn't really a cult survivor. I was just their prisoner for 15 years. But what was interesting is that when I joined the Army, when I chose it, I bought in so hard. And this is actually one of the things where, like, we don't know how to reliably crack the brainwashing of adults and teenagers because we buy into our own indoctrination. But yeah, I think I was saved by being neurodivergent and then also by having a mom who grew up in it as well. So even though I was more abused because I was the daughter of a teenager who had no power, I was also given little tidbits. Like when I'm 3 years old, she taught me that the only thing you need in life is for someone to teach you to read. And then everything else you can teach yourself. But then like books were banned for the next 12 years of my life. And so my logical autistic brain like doesn't like that and was just like, you all are full of shit.
I think you bring up a very important point too in cults. I'm not sure it's part of your steps, is the control of information coming to you. I remember reading in the book, you had comic books that you were allowed to read, which showed the great saver doing different wonderful things, but you weren't allowed real books, you weren't allowed real education. And then you ended up being an excellent student in college, which is really bizarre. So how did, first talking about the control of information, and secondly, how did you beat it?
So, yes, so we grew up under absolute information control on 9/11 when I was 14. It was the first time I ever saw live news on television. And, like, I had to just understand what live news even was. And, like, that's how completely isolated we were. However, on the flip side, you know, they taught us all to read at a very young age and do the basic arithmetic, and it was part of, you know, and to perform. Like I have been, this is me, you know, on the cover, 2 years old, being exploited as a child actress. I was like little Apocalypse Lindsay Lohan, and this is the cult that Joaquina River Phoenix and Rose McGowan came from, and there's this training to perform all the time. Right, to be performing all of the time. And so you learn to bullshit is the honest answer. So when I was in college, I studied literature, and I mean, one reason I was a great student was just because I finally was able to read books and have professors answer them, right, and like explore different things. But part of it was, you know, when I was doing an essay question and I didn't quite know how to answer it, I would just write 3 more paragraphs, and it worked every time. You know, I think one of the core skills we were taught was how to answer questions and how to confuse people and how to, you know, massage everything. And then the third part of that answer is, it wasn't until I was 24 years old and I was reading a book called Third Culture Kids, trying to actually understand what I'd been through. And I read that having good grades can be a sign of depression or of coming from an abusive household. And I was like, oh, that makes so much sense, right? Like I was dropped from complete isolation into a 4,000 kid high school. You know, like I never figured out how to relate to my peers, but like I could impress my teachers, you know, so I did.
Okay, well, we have a question from the audience. They have not read your book yet, but is your perception of the military now only negative? How long were you in for, and at what point did you determine it was a cult that you wanted to leave?
So I was in the Army for 6.5 years. I got out as a captain. I went twice to Afghanistan. And I mean, the answer is I don't look at anything as all good or all bad, right? Like the cult was bad, but I'm fluent in English, Spanish, and Portuguese. You know, the military was very negative in a lot of ways and completely re-traumatized me and triggered me, and I was assaulted and all of this stuff, but also I've never made less than 6 figures, you know, because of what I did in the military. And I have a wonderful husband, and I have a book deal, not because I have a fascinating story or because I'm a great writer, but because I'm a military planning officer, and I built a plan and followed it, and it worked. So I don't look at anything anymore as like all good, all bad. I definitely, on my first day, I was like, oh, this is a cult, you know, and my only reaction to that was, well, I know how to do this better, and I can protect myself from stuff. Like, for example, there's a lot of racism that is used in training to kill people. It is just bonkers. And I was like, I don't have to do that. Like, yes, I have to be in Afghanistan doing this job that none of us really knew what it was until we got there, but I don't have to use the slurs that they use, right? That was just kind of the only thing I looked at. And then when I got out, when I started to leave the cult. So unCULTured starts with the first rule of cults is you're never in a cult. Second rule of cults, I got from my own experience leaving the army and also from watching the Harry Meghan saga, is the cult will forgive any sin except the sin of leaving. And then the third rule of cults is even if he did it doesn't mean he's guilty. But when I was leaving the military, I was like, oh, this is the most like being in a cult process of even anything else. But finally, it wasn't till I was listening to a book on the troubled teen industry. I don't know if any of you have experienced that, but basically it's religious prison camps for children. And I had this crazy experience where I was relating to it from both sides of my brain, right? I was like growing up in a cult and being in military training, except it's much less humane than military training. And that was when I really started to actually be like, oh no, I think this can, meet in a lot of things. What I will say though is going back to my thing of like, the title doesn't actually matter. Calling something a cult doesn't actually matter. And no matter what, the military is not going away today. But we can start working on individual things. And that's what I felt like. Like when I realized that when you go on a deployment, you activate all 10 of my things. I immediately was like, I understand more about soldier suicide, both at war and when we come home. I think every battalion commander should be meeting with someone like me, deciding who we're going to put. If you know this is a cultic experience, well, now the person you put as the charismatic leader is very, very important, right? We can train soldiers on the signs of the logic breaking down. We can understand how crazy it is to take people from a year in a cult and just drop them back with their families. And this is really it for me, like why I compare everything to a cult is because it's like it can help you do better. It's not necessarily to demonize it, but it can also help you understand what you've been through, because something else that we know that we've had quite a few psychologists say is it might be impossible to heal from cults or group-related trauma without understanding it, understanding what happened to you. I think is a really important part of dealing with groups.
Just addressing the students here, and I've talked in class as well, on our corners sometimes, on Henry Avenue Schoolhouse, you have people handing out various different things, whether they're Bibles or asking you to come to a certain e-reading or whatever it be. Why are students particularly susceptible? Why are they such easy marks?
Yeah, always have been, by the way. College students are like the favorites for cults. And it's because it's a transitional period of your life, really is what it comes down to. So there's two things that scholars have found that make you likely to be abused by a cult. And I like to really emphasize, like, the reason people join cults is because a cult leader builds a cult and a cult recruiter goes out with deceptive practices to get you in. However, so there's two things. One is being a seeker, which is like looking to answer life's big questions and not being satisfied with the way things are. I think being a seeker is a good thing. The second thing is lack of social connections. And so if you think about college, right, you've just left home, usually for the first time. All of your friends that you've been going to school with your whole life did not come with you. Maybe you're going through a breakup. There's also something significant when you're going through two things at the same time. If you struggle with depression and you just had a breakup, or if you're really missing home and your teacher gives you an F, right? Just like different things. My grandfather joined the Children of God because he had a very bad LSD trip where he swears he met Satan. And so the next day he was sitting in a park with his head in his hands, as one does after they meet Satan, and up came the Children of God, right? And like he didn't know what he was looking for, but he thought he knew for sure that he found it. But the actual important part of that story is cults are looking for the person sitting by themselves in the park with their head in their hands. And one of the things that I tell parents, but I think is also very good for college students, is like, if you want to raise a child who is safe from cults, you have to have a lot of different social connections, and they can't all be connected to one another, right? Because that's how you are going to be more safe. There was actually a high-level Scientology recruiter once who was asked, like, what is the thing that spoils your plans the most when you're trying to hook somebody in? He was like, oh, it's when a friend comes along and is like, no, we're not doing this, let's go. And that's why they try to isolate you from your friends so early on. One of the telltale signs that can be good to look for is when someone goes, okay, now like the majority of people are not going to understand this. Your friends and family might not get this. And I love to say, you should just look at them and be like, what are you trying to say about my friends and family? Right? But like, the thing that a cult gives you is a feeling of superiority and the absolute confidence that your thing is the right thing. And so I have three good like cult vaccines quotes. One is, there are no gurus. One is, there are many valid ways to live a life. And the third is, if it's valid, it stands up to scrutiny. But honestly, anyone that is trying to convince you that their way, their method, their idea, or their group is the only way, or that it works for everyone, like they're trying to cult you or they're trying to con you. Because it's just, that's not the way the world works, right? Like, no one person is the only person having a certain idea at one time.
So how do you then help others get out of a cult? Because it sounds like you would then be the one coming in saying, well, I have the right idea, you should leave this, why don't you now follow my line of thinking?
Anti-cult groups can become very cult-like, that is for sure. I mean, we don't, going back to like, nobody has advice on how to help people leave cults. There's one guy who figured it out, Ted Patrick, worked for Governor Reagan, called himself Black Lightning, and would snatch and grab people out of cults at their parents' behests and then actively deprogram them. And this is illegal. And he went to jail. But we don't have a lot of legal ways that we know. And I always tell people, like, my grandfather still runs the money for the Children of God, right? Like, if we knew how to do it, I would have my grandfather out of there. But, so I would say, like, nobody knows how to crack brainwashing. My way of helping, being very conscious of what you said, David, is before I even got into the business where I have to be online and I have to tell my story and I have to talk about my lessons, I was like, this is so creepy. It's like social media is built to be like culty. And so that's when I created my Guru Gotcha checklist. And I was like, this is for me, first of all, like the 20 signs of toxic leadership. Like, this is for me to keep myself in check. Another thing that I do, well, I don't build groups of any kind, but I have built kind of like online communities. But I really, really, really make a concerted effort to spend at least 25, if not 50% of my channels is like other people's ideas, other people's information, other people's books. So I am I'm a curator of information, right? I have interesting insights, but in no way am I special or the only one. I'm sorry. This is one of my top red flag for both leaders and groups is a focus on your own uniqueness. Like, anyone, every nonprofit will do it, every mission-based anything will do it, and it's like, no, like, you have to keep some level of intellectual humility that you do not have all the perspectives. Yeah.
So there's another question from the audience. It's a two-parter. Do you think that you joined the military because of the comfort of rules? And what strategies or tactics did you find were most effective in indoctrinating intelligent people?
So the hardest chapter of unCULTured to write is the one nobody ever guesses. It's chapter 17. It's the chapter where I'm in college. It's a pretty nice chapter. Except I met a very, very toxic man. And his name is William Jeffrey Poole, and you can Google him because that's how toxic he was. I don't want to give away the spoiler, but like real bad guy. And I had such a hard time admitting that like that's part of why I joined the military, is because I was in a toxic relationship when I had to write the book. But it also, like looking back now, 100% did I join because of the comfort of the structure of rules. And if I hadn't joined the military, I would have had a PhD by 25. Like I was not ready to just graduate from college, and I didn't know the first thing about the real world. Even though I spent 6 years in school, and even looking back now, I see that I did it to myself in college. I was working 2 to 4 jobs at any given time, plus making straight A's with no background, right? So I put myself in such a high control environment that I didn't have to think about anything that wasn't school, right? And then I literally describe when I signed up for the Army and I was graduating and I was taking 21 credit hours trying to make straight A's, and I was a valedictorian. And I looked so forward to basic training, where for 3 whole months, I would not have to think. My brain would just get to rest. And it's actually one of the cliches that we say in the Army, or like the only thing you have to do to be successful in the Army is be in the right place, the right time, in the right uniform, and never volunteer for anything, right? Don't stand out. And I literally, when I joined the Army, it did not feel like joining a cult. It just felt like falling forward into a group that was just going to catch me. And in fact, many neurodivergent people are drawn to things like the military or high control groups because it's so hard to navigate society. And like, here's a uniform, here's a rank, here's a group of friends that you call a team, right? Like everything is kind of given to you, if only you cannot be an individual. Which is also why neurodivergent people usually get out of the military pretty quickly as well.
Daniella, I can't believe we're running out of time, so I just want to ask, because I think it's a very important question, and I want you to have time to meet students afterwards and sell your book, which is a very important thing. If someone in the audience is in a cult or knows somebody that is, what would you recommend that they do?
So I'm like, it sounds self-serving, but I wrote this book because the way that I wrote it, right? Like even like any member of your family, no matter where they are politically, you can just be like, oh my God, there's this book about this woman that grew up in a horrible cult and then became a captain in the Army. And like, that's all you have to tell them, and the book will do the work. Like it is literally begging you to understand like what cults are you in. But when you realize you are in coercive control, you need to leave. You need to leave. And you need to, like, there's usually the crack in the brainwashing, and then there's physically and mentally leaving. And then there's a decade of deconstruction, of, like, understanding what happened to you. But you need to find, community and purpose and mission is, like, very, very important. But also you need to understand, like, much like when you're recovering from an abusive relationship, part of healing is understanding that you might never reach those levels of passion again because that passion wasn't actually healthy for you. So part of what you need to do after you come out of a cult or a coercive situation is understand that your levels for like community enmeshment and mission and purpose are just sky high. You know, say with veterans, they're like jonesing so hard for the mission that if you don't find another thing within like 2 years, I think it's dangerous. And then the last thing, and this usually takes a little time and a couple versions of cult hopping. Most people don't just do one high control group. And that's because the thing nobody wants to say is that cults give you a feeling of superiority, right? This is why you don't like talking to vegans, but you don't know why, right? Cults give you a feeling of superiority. And once you realize that, like, that's what's going to help you recover and not need to join cults anymore. And really, like, I think I went through so many groups being like, what makes me special? What makes me special? What makes me special? And there's actually a point in the book where somebody tells me to get the F over myself because I'm not as different as I think I am. And that to me was like a really, really important message. I think we're seeing this a lot with like white people right now, by the way, right? Like white supremacy is coming down. We all see it. And a lot of white people are frantically trying to figure out what is going to make them special. And the answer is nothing. But I also think it's comforting, right? Like it's comforting to realize there isn't just one way to live a life, right? Like you don't need to spend your life looking for the way. Like you don't. You can just find groups that are healthy for you.
Okay. Let's wrap it up.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for coming. And thank you, Daniella, for talking about your experience with cult behavior. It's so important for us to keep talking about these issues to change society's normal and to further inform and educate others about it. It was such an honor to have you, Daniella, come here and talk about your experience. And again, we post our roundtables to our YouTube and SoundCloud, and we are broadcasted on the first and third Sundays of each month from 8 to 9 a.m. on G-Town Radio 92.5 FM WGGT. Thank you so much for listening, and have a great day.